Hi folks, welcome to the NHC Annual Budget Forum. We are just about to get started. If you're having any trouble connecting to the webinar, I suggest going back to the link that came in the email originally. If you have any further trouble, you can shoot us an email or a tweet and we'll do what we can to help you out. With that, let me hand it over to Chris Estes, our President and CEO. Chris?
Thanks, Ethan, and again, welcome everyone. Thank you for being on this year's Budget Forum. As most of you know, NHC has been doing this for quite some time and really believe in the importance of discussing the President's budget as it's released and doing sort of a analysis by folks who work in affordable housing field on what the budget means for our work, for your work, and a little bit about sort of how we see the budget process moving forward and what you all can do in terms of understanding how to talk about the budget and the opportunities that it might present. I want to thank Ethan Handelman, our Vice President of Policy, and Caitlin Snyder, a Policy Associate, for putting this event together. I invite you all to visit our website after this to take advantage of the many materials we have, and please note this is NHC's 85th anniversary as an organization, so we're excited to be doing a lot of historical look back at many of the things the organization's been involved in. But for now, I want to thank all the speakers who have agreed to be a part of this event and turn things over to Dr. Lisa Sturtevant, our Vice President of Research, who's going to discuss our most recent housing landscape report. Lisa?
Great, thanks, Chris. Thanks to everyone who's joining us today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And you know, my job here is to maybe set a little bit of context for the conversation and to present findings from this year's housing landscape, which we're officially releasing today. This is one of NHC's principal research reports, along with Paycheck to Paycheck, that analyzes housing affordability trends in the U.S. And we really try to provide those who work on housing issues with the data that we need to talk about housing affordability, particularly the housing affordability challenges of working individuals and families. So if we go back to that. So I'm going to talk about the numbers from the report, but I just want to say our report is a little bit different. There's a lot of reports out there on analyzing housing affordability or cost burden, and this focuses specifically on low and moderate income working households. So these are households where at least one member goes out to a job and where the household income is up to 120% of area median income. So this could be a single working professional, this could be a family with two workers. You know, for example, in Atlanta, 120% of AMI is about $81,000. So this could be a child care worker and a mechanic. In San Francisco, this could be an elementary school teacher and, you know, a school bus driver. And so these are folks who work in the community, and millions of these working households in the United States are severely cost burdened. That is, they spend more than half of their income on housing each month. And what we know from the research is when individuals spend a disproportionate share of their income on housing, there's often not enough left over for other household necessities like health care, food, child care, clothing, education, and so on. We're going to see the burden continues to be greatest for renters as we see rent escalate in many parts of the country because of increased demand. And when we look at the data, we see that minority households are significantly more likely to be cost burdened than white households. And even those who don't face affordability challenges, there are many who are living in housing and neighborhoods that are really still very disconnected from opportunity. So to look at some of the data from this year's report, in 2014, about 1/4 of low and moderate income working renters and about 16% of owners were severely cost burdened in 2014. And you can see that the shares of severely cost burdened households have declined slightly since 2011. And this decline is mostly because of a decline in owner costs following the downturn and the housing market bust. But there's also been modest improvements in household incomes among this particular population over this time period. But as you can see from this chart, for the first time in 3 years, the number of severely cost-burdened working renters edged up slightly. And what we know then is that for many households, rents are rising faster than incomes in this last year. There's something else going on, though. In addition to rents rising faster than incomes for some people, more working households are renting instead of owning. So the composition of renters and owners is changing. And for some, this increase in renting suggests that there's some element of choice, right? There's a large millennial population that's coming into the age where they're forming their own households. They're most likely to be renters. A lot of them are in this income range up to 120% of area median income. So there's just a larger pool of potential renters in the population. But for many others, they're renting because they experienced a foreclosure during the downturn, or they're having difficulty saving for a down payment or getting access to credit. So this renting by choice, renting by necessity, both of these components are really putting upward pressure on rents, and particularly when we've seen new supply being added pretty slowly in the market. So one driver of the changing cost burden numbers over the past few years is the trends of housing costs and household incomes for this particular population we look at. This chart shows that overall household incomes for this group have increased since 2011. And sometimes we've seen this is because more people are working more hours. That's how incomes are going up. Sometimes it's because households have added workers, and sometimes it's because wages have in fact gone up for some segment of this population. Rents have also gone up, although we can see not quite as much as incomes over this full 3-year period, and the cost of home ownership for this group are lower in 2014 than they were in 2011. While the 3-year period shows incomes rising somewhat faster than housing costs for this group of working households, between 2013 and 2014, rents continued to press up, increasing by 3.3%. And for the first time in 4 years, the cost of owning among this group increased in 2014. So these rising housing costs suggest that many working households will continue to have difficulty finding affordable housing in the years to come. One of the most interesting charts in our latest report, and one that we just started tracking last year, is where we look at the shares of working households that are severely cost burdened by race and by Hispanic origin. So this is for all low and moderate income working households. It includes both renters and owners. And you can see that 17.8% of white working households, low and moderate income working households, are severely cost burdened, and that those shares are higher for African Americans, for Hispanic households, and for Asian households. So we see from this data that working minority households are much more likely to be severely cost burdened than their white counterparts, but even these statistics mask a more complicated picture. We're getting more evidence about the types of housing and the neighborhoods that lower income households, particularly lower income minority households, are living. And so we know that even if a household is not cost burdened, there's some growing evidence that minority households are more likely to live in neighborhoods that are disconnected from opportunity, including transit, access to jobs, good schools, and so on. So this is a reminder that as we look at these affordability numbers, which are really for metropolitan areas as a whole, we increasingly are going to want to take into consideration neighborhood location, neighborhood quality, and the relationship to opportunity, in addition to just pure cost burden when we think about housing affordability. If we look at the next slide, we know, not surprisingly, that lower income households are much more likely than moderate income households to be cost burdened. Nearly 80% of extremely low income households are severely cost burdened. Again, these are working households. And it's important to keep in mind that these numbers here, this chart that shows this percentage of households that are severely cost burdened, these don't include households that receive housing assistance that limit their rent to 30% of their income, right? They're out of this graph. They're not cost burdened. So what this says is that federal housing assistance still, as we know, doesn't reach everybody who's eligible. And for many of the lowest income working households, this can include minimum wage workers in some regions, home health aides, retail and restaurant workers. Housing costs are more than half of their income each month. And there's a lot of variation in the share of working households. We often talk about housing affordability and present national numbers, but it really does vary quite a bit when you look across the United States. when you look at the state level, California, Hawaii, and New Jersey are the states with the highest shares of working households that are severely cost burdened. The metros with the highest shares are Los Angeles, Miami, and New York. And in each of these metros, over a third of low and moderate income working households spend more than half of their income on housing each month. So just by way of conclusion, I know we're going to spend a good bit of the rest of this webinar talking about policy implications. And what I hope this review of some of the affordability data has demonstrated is that what we know is that current programs designed to help working households afford housing fall far short of what is needed. And a big part of the issue is on the supply side. So in addition to federal programs, there's a role for states and local localities, cities and counties to consider the tax, zoning, and land use policies that can incentivize the production of housing. And there's increasing awareness of the importance of location to the ability for individuals to move up the economic ladder. So as we talk about policy implications and affordable housing strategies, we do that in the context of the new Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, which provides states and localities with more resources to identify fair housing issues and to help develop these strategies that can ease housing cost burdens and also to promote the development and preservation of housing that can link families to opportunity. So more to come in the discussion to follow by folks who are working on the ground. But for now, I will stop with that, and I will turn it back over to Ethan.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think that provides us the perfect setup for our panel, because what we're going to do now is move to a panel discussion looking at the opportunities and the challenges presented by the federal budget. Again, this is Ethan Handelman, Vice President for Policy and Advocacy with NHC, and by means of setup, let me give just a little context for how the federal budget works as a way to help you think about how to get involved in this and how best to interpret the information you're getting. So when the federal government does its budgeting, it starts at the very top level, and you may have heard about this, right, because we're in the second year of a 2-year budget agreement that set the total discretionary spending cap. It's called the 302A level. That's at the top of the waterfall. From that, Congress decides how to split up that discretionary authority among 12 different appropriation subcommittees. One of those is for transportation and housing. That's also called the THUD or THUD budget. I like THUD much better. From that, there's a split. Some of it goes to transportation, some of it goes to housing. So it goes down the waterfall again to HUD's budget. Then you start the waterfall that many of you pay stricter attention to, right? Because HUD's budget spends a whole lot, about 80% by our calculation, just to keep people who are currently housed with housing assistance housed. Right? It's basically just renewal. So that's, you can see in the slide the list of the programs we included in that, but they're all existing recipients. Everything else is in that last 20%. That's home, that's CDBG, and there's a reason those are in big capital letters because they take up the bulk of that amount. But all of the other programs fit in that small slice. The reason to walk through the waterfall is when you're thinking about how to affect the funding that goes to any one particular program, the best way to do it is go back to that 302A and the 302B level to make the pie higher, as was once said, to increase the total amount available for allocation, because once you get to the HUD budget level in the waterfall, those buckets are pretty much decided. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but anything that expands at the cost of some other form of housing assistance. So if we really want to make a difference in how many people are housed and housed effectively and affordably, we have to do it at the top level. So that's background, that's context for the discussion we're having today. We're going to get into the specifics. We're going to get into how the programs interrelate. We'll talk about the priorities we see in the President's budget. We'll talk about what that means for folks doing the work of housing on the ground and for the people in the communities they serve. But keep in your mind, this is all about, if we want to advocate, we got to advocate at that top level. Fortunately, there's a great way to do it. There's currently an advocacy letter circulating around the 302B allocation for housing and transportation. It's a great way to lend your support to a mass effort that in past has gotten more than 3,000 organizations signed on from all 50 states, pushing for, again, that larger allocation. there are housing groups, there are transportation groups, a wide range of folks from different political parties and all different parts of the country. So you will see a link to that in the chat that Caitlin is sending out through the webinar. You can see it on our website. There are lots of other housing organizations that are working towards this. It's certainly not just NHC, it's many, many others. Through the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, CHCDF. So however you choose to sign on, please do, because that makes a big difference in how Congress and policymakers make the allocation decisions that affect the funding for all the individual programs. With that, I get to give you some indication of what to expect this year, right? We'll have more of this in the discussion format, but the thing you're most likely to see is partisanship and more partisanship over this budget. It's an election year, and we know it's an election year. So there's not going to probably be a lot of detail level appropriations work going on there. There will be at the staff level, but I expect a lot of the elected officials will be more focused on the election. It's a feature of our democracy. If they fail to achieve a specific compromise, a specific set of decisions around funding this year, likely they'll default to the spending level set in the 2-year budget compromise that's already reached. That's not a done deal, but if I had to make a bet on what's likely, the fact that there's something already on the books is likely to win the day. That's, again, why the 302B level for housing and transportation is so important, because that overall spending level has been set, but those individual 12 subcommittee allocations have not, and those can still move. So to the extent you want to work on housing, that's the place to work. There's a link up there. You will have to type it in, or you can go right to the National Low Income Housing Coalition website. They've got links to it and have been doing a ton of work to get this out there. So thanks to NLIHC for all the work it's been doing on this 302B allocation. We hope you will all support the effort. Now I will introduce our panelists, because we have 4 great speakers who can speak to how housing work gets done and how it gets funded at all sorts of different levels of government. First up will be Laura Hogshead, who comes to us from HUD. You have heard her on budget forums in the past. She's one of our favorites, as are all of our other panelists, but she's great to have. She will go first. Next will be Aaron Gornstein, who is President and CEO of Preservation of Affordable Housing, also known as POA. And before that was at the state level, the Undersecretary for Housing and Community Development in Massachusetts, and before that, for many years, led the state-level advocacy organization, CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association. Following him will be Adrian Todman, the Executive Director of our local DC Housing Authority, another repeat presenter at our budget forum and very much a favorite. And lastly will be a new presenter, Susan Dewey, who is the Executive Director of the Virginia Housing Development Authority and really understands what's going on at the state level and how it intersects with the federal and the local level. You can see more detailed bios of each of our presenters in the handout section of the webinar. You'll see it on the sort of toolbar bit on the right. So if you want to learn more about them, you can go there, read about them as they're speaking, but of course you will be paying strict attention to everything they have to say. With that, I'm going to switch over to Laura and let her take you through the high-level summary of what's in HUD's budget proposal.
Great. Thank you, Ethan. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you all for signing up to listen to this, especially because my news has been out there for more than a week. So I'm impressed that you want to hear it again, and I'll try to keep it very high level and not get into the detailed numbers so that we can leave lots of time for discussion. So starting with the PowerPoint. This is HUD's vision for 2017. As Ethan said, when we go through this process, we make sure that our budget reflects our priorities and our values, and at HUD we are working to become the Department of Opportunity. It's what the Secretary calls us all the time, and we want to make sure that we're living up to that. So here you see just our very foundational vision of how we look at this budget. And when we started talking with OMB many, many months ago about this budget, these are the core principles that we kept coming back to. Ending homelessness, helping families and individuals secure quality housing, making stronger communities, increasing economic mobility, and building a stronger HUD. That last one is the one that I work most on, and I will say if we don't build a stronger HUD, none of the other things happen. So that's why we're focusing on that as one of our core values as well. So moving to the budget, We have requested $48.9 billion, which is an increase of $1.9 billion above the FY16 enacted level that we just got in December. And let me put that into a little bit of context. Ethan has gone through the 302As, the 302Bs. When we looked at the task that we were given, both OMB and HUD, to come up with this budget, we were looking from the budget caps that were agreed to for FY16 and FY17. So the agreement that was made was $80 billion over 2 years. That was split $50 billion towards FY16, which leaves $30 billion for FY17. You can see right there we've got an issue, right? Because we've spent more in FY16 than we have to spend in FY17, which made FY17 incredibly tight. You further divide that between defense and non-defense, split evenly, $15 billion for defense, $15 billion for everything that is non-defense. And of that $15 billion, HUD is claiming $1.9 billion in this budget. We feel very good about that, knowing all of the other priorities of the government out there, and we feel good that it's an increase above FY16, but we do acknowledge that this is a tough budget year. We are adhering to the budget caps. As Ethan said, Congress will have to decide if they are going to do the same. But the President's budget is happy to abide by those agreements that we made last year. So as Ethan said, a lot of our budget is just keeping folks in the homes that they are in already, and we have to make very wise decisions around that other 20% and how we spend it best. So moving to the next slide, this is where we see some of the biggest increases from 2016, and we're using 2016 as the base because we're still getting used to those numbers since we just got them in 2016. And you'll see that most of this is keeping folks in their homes. Certainly tenant-based rental assistance, project-based rental assistance, those are keeping folks in the homes that they're in, and we've tried to put in some of the impact of what this is. Where it says continue assistance, that's what that means, keep the folks in their homes. We have a couple of new things, including the incremental vouchers at $88 million, which is 10,000 new vouchers for homeless families. And we're very happy about that because we do want to continue to expand that pie. We've asked for an increase of $75 million for choice neighborhoods, which will allow us to do 6 more implementation grants and more planning and action grants. Just a word on the project-based rental assistance. We are fully funding 12-month renewals on a calendar basis, so we're sticking with the formula that we put into place a couple of years ago that we had lots of discussions about, and we're happy to say that this is full funding for the owners. You'll see a big increase in homeless assistance grants as well, which includes new rapid rehousing units, chronic beds, which we'll go through in just a minute, and a focus on youth, a continued focus on youth. We have not to date been able to put any money into RAD. These have been deals that could close of their own accord, but this year we are proposing $50 million for RAD, and we are including conversion for 202 PRAC units for the first time, so that's a notable difference from last year. And we're very happy to say that this year represents the first increase in the number of years on Native American housing block grants, so $50 million increase there. So moving through each of them very quickly, and I won't go through all of these because you've seen these numbers, but we want to highlight on the discretionary side, the homeless assistance grants will create 25,500 new units of permanent supportive housing to end chronic homelessness. So all of the homeless assistance that we've put into this budget supports the goals of opening doors, which is the plan to end homelessness. And this is one of those accounts where I'm so happy to say we have such good data. And we made all of these decisions based on data. We know exactly what it's going to take to end chronic homelessness because of the very good data that we have from the PIT counts and from a lot of the work that you all do. You give us this data, we are using it to make the best decisions that we can make. We are also doing 8,000 units of rapid rehousing for homeless families and increasing our funding on a project targeted to homeless youth. The Congress gave us $33 million last year to do a specific focus on homeless youth. We are expanding the number of cities if we get this $25 million. And then we touched on the $88 million for tenant-based rental assistance vouchers, those 10,000 new vouchers for homeless families with children. So even though you see it in a couple of places in our budget, this all ties together with the theme of ending homelessness. It's all data-driven. It's all research-driven. We know from the Family Options Study what works for families in varying states, and in varying states of distress. And so we want to make sure that we put the money towards what we know works through our research. Now moving on to maybe the most exciting part of our budget, the mandatory ask. So this is the first year that we have put a significant ask on the mandatory side of the budget, and we don't do that lightly. It's been a conversation that HUD has had for several years, and this is the year that we said it's time. So we have put a request in for $11 billion in new mandatory funding over 10 years to, again, support the goal of ending homelessness among all of America's families by 2020. So this funding will support rapid rehousing and tenant-based rental assistance vouchers for 550,000 homeless families with children. That, again, is based on our data and what we know we need. It is split basically 80% towards vouchers, 20% towards rapid rehousing, and it's all based on the rigorous research that we've done over the last few years. Again, we're putting this on the mandatory side because we believe that is where we can best solve this problem. Ethan talked about the caps. Things are getting tighter and tighter on the discretionary side, and we very firmly believe that this is an appropriate place to ask for mandatory funding. So that's what's really new and different about this budget. Moving to the next slide, helping families and individuals secure quality housing. Again, we've talked about tenant-based and project-based rental assistance, public housing capital and operating fund, and programs like 811 and 202. They're not enormous increases, but in the choices that we had to make, we wanted to make sure we were protecting families that we have and expanding where we can according to the research. On the next slide, making communities stronger. This is where we want to make our stand that we are also improving communities. We're improving families and individuals' housing where they are and where they want to be. So where tenant-based rental assistance helps families make choices to move to different neighborhoods perhaps, we want to make sure that we are not abandoning neighborhoods. And our RAD effort, our Choice Neighborhoods efforts around Jobs Plus and community building help us to support neighborhoods where they are, because our intent is not to move everyone, right? We want to make sure that we've got support for communities all over America, and we're trying to do that in urban, rural, and tribal communities. I want to note just quickly at the bottom of this slide that $300 million in mandatory spending for local housing policy grants is another place where we have put a mandatory ask in, and this is going to help us with flexibility around local efforts. So very much in the spirit of CDBG and local decision making, we are trying to make mandatory spending available for folks to make the right decision for their communities about making development easier in communities. I'm sure Adrian knows a lot about how hard that is, and making sure that we are supporting communities in those efforts as well. On the next slide, continuing on making communities stronger, we are also proposing more flexibility for CDBG to do more regional efforts. We are, as I said before, increasing Native American housing block grants and adding a new $20 million set aside for Native youth. That's within the iCDBG program, and that could go for funding things such as community centers and health clinics. We are also increasing the CDBG set-aside, or proposing to increase it for Colonias to 15% for those 4 states that have Colonias along the U.S.-Mexico border. And then, interestingly, this is a proposal that we had last year, but we're proposing again the Upward Mobility Project, which would allow 10 communities to combine 4 streams of funding: HUD, on the HUD side, CDBG and homes, and on the HHS side, the social services and community services block grants. They could combine those funding and use those streams of funding and use them more flexibly than perhaps any of the 4 programs would, with all of their own rules, would allow. So this is a pilot to try to see if that will help communities make larger, more impactful decisions with those dollars. On the next slide, making sure that everyone has access to economic and upward mobility. Certainly fully funding PHA administrative fees is a big part of that, because PHAs can't do it all without the funding that they need. We are also, for this year, for the first time, proposing a $15 million mobility counseling demonstration, again, research-oriented. We know from lots of studies over the years, we know what it takes for families to move and to be supported in new neighborhoods. So we are proposing $15 million for mobility counselors. The Secretary has also made a push for narrowing the digital divide through $5 million on Connect Home. He is currently working with 21 cities across the country where PHAs and private developers and internet service providers have come together. So far, we've put no money towards this, just lots of connections, lots of putting the right people in the right room together. And this is the first year that we're asking for $5 million to help for coordinators to make sure that those connections are happening. And then again, we are asking up to $30 million for an FHA administrative fee for lenders to pay in so that we can help to modernize FHA and do quality assurance work. Next, we have what else we are working on outside of the budget. Sorry, keep going. That's right. Outside of the budget, we also wanted to make sure that you know of the work that we're doing on rules. And so we have a few that are exciting and upcoming. We've got the National Housing Trust Fund implementation coming up this summer. We're very pleased about that. I know you all have seen the smoke-free rules for public housing. We have the Equal Access Rule coming out soon and the Over-Income Rule. We are proposing to include the inclusion of broadband infrastructure in all HUD-funded new construction and substantial rehab, so that if an entity is undertaking a substantial rehab or building something new, that we build it with that capability from the beginning. And then, as always, we are trying to streamline administrative regulations for all of our programs because we want to make sure they run as efficiently as possible. So that goes through my very quick update on budget, and I know you've seen all those numbers before, but I'm happy to answer questions after the rest of the panelists have a chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and that's exactly right. We're going to do some Q&A with the whole panel after everyone has had a chance. I'm seeing already we're getting some great questions through the webinar interface. Please feel free to put those in there. I am reading them. I'll bring them up to our panelists and try and make sure we cover as much as possible in the time available. With that, I'm going to turn it over next to Aaron Gornstein from POA. Aaron, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ethan, and thanks to NHC for the leadership on housing advocacy and policy, and overall very pleased with the HUD budget. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the HUD leadership for fighting for the resources we need. I just wanted to go through a few of the programs that are important around preservation. We could do that. Next slide. The project-based rental assistance program is really critical to preserving and revitalizing existing affordable housing. Ethan mentioned the 80% of the budget that's for existing households. This is a part of it, but a very important one that serves some of our most vulnerable households, most who are elderly and senior citizens. And one of the things, just to add to what Laura described about the project-based rental assistance, is that the number is up by about 2%, but it is assuming some savings through a proposed change in the medical deduction and the calendar year renewal. And so we're looking at more closely whether this is in fact going to be enough funding, but HUD, as you had heard, believes that it will fund all renewals. The next program is the tenant protection vouchers, which is on the next slide, and this is often overlooked, but it's critical to avoid displacement of HUD-assisted housing where contracts are terminating or expiring. And another key part of this is we've used this program to project-based vouchers to facilitate preservation transactions. So another important features of the tenant protection vouchers. We believe that this account may be underfunded to be able to meet all the needs in FY17. The next slide is really, and I'm sure you'll hear more from the other panelists on capital investments. As we're preserving the existing stock, obviously we need to add supply, as Lisa's research indicates. And there's the CDBG program and the home program, which have been facing cutbacks over the past several years. Glad to see that home is at least level funded, but it's certainly we'd like to see that go up. CDBG is facing a cut, so we're very concerned about that. Very pleased that Choice Neighborhoods is increased. I do want to mention one other capital investment that Laura mentions, the Housing Trust Fund, which is slated to get $130 million in this upcoming fiscal year, and the states now are putting their allocations plan in place. And just to finish up on resident services, there's been a lot of great work in the housing community in recent years on increasing access to health, education, employment, financial stability. This is the next slide, and community engagement. And in addition, groups are now really looking at outcome measures, how to, and collecting the data to make our case. And again, there's been a lot of great progress on not just building and renovating housing and preserving it, but working with our residents to increase their economic mobility and increase their success. And the Family Self-Sufficiency Program is one really important program, which is level funded in the budget. It's now available under authorizing language to owners of project-based Section 8 like POA, so we're now running a pilot program in 4 properties. We're really excited about that. There's also the Jobs Plus program for public housing residents, which is also important. And a non-budget item, I just mentioned that important to realize that the whole issue of support services in senior housing and the demo that is out on the streets of NOFA to test different models for helping seniors age in place. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I think you hit a bunch of key issues that we're going to discuss in just a minute. Again, we're getting great questions based on your remarks in the webinar format. We're going to do that in just a second. Also, a reminder before we move to our next speaker, all the slides and a recording of the full webinar will be available after. You'll get a follow-up email with links to that. At this point, let me turn the mic over to Adrienne Todman.
Great. Thank you very much, Ethan, and let me give a fond shout out to all of my housing authority comrades across the country. If you are listening in, we're fighting the good fight out there, but also thank you to all of you who advocate very strongly for our issues and in all sectors, whether it be to electeds and to your neighbors around the block. I'm so thankful. We do a lot of hard work, housing authorities, and our issues and the people that we house are not usually welcomed and easy. And so we really do respect the work that you are doing on our behalf. And thank you, NHC, for this budget forum. It's very helpful to break down the issues. I am going to talk generally about the impact of this budget on our real programs. As you can tell from the first slide here, that's a map of the city of the District of Columbia, and the Housing Authority, we're everywhere. We're not just in east of the river, where many people, if you're familiar with the city, we are everywhere in DC. So how HUD funds us impacts our city, and I'd say that is not unlike many localities, particularly in the urban core, where the Housing Authority breadth is wide. And so it's important that we are funded because of the impacts we really have at the local level. I want to start off talking about what I refer to as our day-to-day landlord money, and that's the operating subsidy. The budget this year does have a slight bump up to get to an 87% proration, and while I am very thankful that there is a bump up to 87%, it is a very slight bump. And so when I talk about the impact of our housing throughout DC, we look like public housing because of a level of disinvestment in this important infrastructure in our country, not just the past couple years, but for decades. And in fact, we've only, in the past 16 years, we've only been funded for 4 of those past 16 years. And when you think about how old our stock is in DC, our oldest public housing site was built in 1934 at Langston Terrace. When you think about sites like that and not having full funding each year, it's devastating, not just to the residents who live there, but from the community who expects more from their government. I'd like to, though, show you a couple of our sites to give you, each one of our sites has a generation effect. So this is a picture of Kelly Miller Townhomes. These are recently rehabbed townhomes using capital fund and stimulus funds. It's located near Howard University, and it looks great. I mean, the families who've moved in are happy. We do need our landlord money, our operating subsidy for these sites to work well, but as you can see, we're working hard to make sure that they're pleasant. Stepping it down a little bit, this is a Fort Dupont started dwellings, 278 units in Southeast DC in Ward 7. Now not recently rehabbed. These are units that we're working very hard just to keep up with the day-to-day maintenance that we have, and the backlog of capital needs are just not being met. The next slide is Greenleaf Gardens. Again, the same story as Fort Dupont started dwellings, but here at Greenleaf, we are actively now engaged in a robust planning process with the residents and the community to redevelop this site. Greenleaf is one of my favorite sites for a number of reasons, including the very warm people that live there, but also just the huge opportunity that it will provide, not just to the residents and the community, but the whole city, if we're able to unlock some of the very valuable assets of that whole community, and not just replace all of the public housing that's there, but also bring new housing to the footprint, which is so important to cities like DC, where the real estate market is just off the chain, that we can provide for housing, not just for our very low-income families, but really families at every level. And the next slide which I'll dwell on a little bit, is our Barry Farm Dwellings, which is beyond the planning phase in some degree and really in our active redevelopment pipeline. Barry Farm is one of our 2 largest sites in our portfolio with 432 units. And I'm sad to say those pictures make Barry Farm look pretty. It is a tough site. It had a really kind of bizarre rehab job about 25 years ago that didn't do us any favor. And so we're living with the fact that that 87% proration and sadly the lack of funding on the capital fund side, and some of you saw Laura's numbers, are just not keeping up with what we need. And we are going to be redeveloping Barry Farm from the 400 or so units on there right now to almost 1,500 units on the site. Again, not just replacing the public housing that families need and having families be able to return, but also increasing the housing that we need, particularly for working class and middle class families here in DC. And then in the last slide here on our public housing is what could be. So Capitol Quarter, which some of you, if you've been to DC and I've taken you on a tour, we make sure that you see this, used to be 707 distressed public housing sites, the Capra-Carlsberg site, and today it looks like what you see on the right. Beautiful townhomes, a mixture of home ownership and rental. I'm very proud to say that we're going to be cutting the ribbon on an additional phase of that, of this particular site soon. But this is what an integrated, healthy community should look like. Families of every income, every race, living next to each other, and we get there by programs like Choice. And so I'm very excited to see that there's an increase in the Choice funding, and I'm hoping that our colleagues on the Hill listen to that proposal. I want to pivot to our voucher program because, you know, it is the largest of the programs for most housing authorities that we administer, particularly here in DC. Well, we have 8,000 public housing units. We are serving 14,000 families through our Housing Choice Voucher Program. And many people understand how vouchers work. Unfortunately, not a lot of people understand the importance of the administrative fee. And over I find myself describing to folks who work on the Hill and just anybody who cares, you know, why do you need that money? It just seems like you're hiring a bunch of bureaucrats to run around town. The administrative fee is very important. So number one, we want to make sure that people are eligible for the program. So it's paying for people to determine eligibility. Everybody wants families to live in safe and good places. And so in order to do that, we have to pay for inspectors to go out, take a look at the units on an annual basis. Everybody wants to make sure their taxpayer dollars are going to people who deserve to still be in the program. So each year, housing authorities are re-upping families through a recertification. That takes time, money, and people as well. One of my favorites is we help families find good units. You know, it is very difficult, particularly in a city like DC and also out, you know, LA and New York out there as well, San Francisco. It is hard to find affordable, good units, and increasingly so here in this country. And we take the time to help our families do that. We sometimes transport them. That takes money. And if you care about mobility, if you care about some of the issues that so many people are talking about now, as research is showing, you want us to do this job. We can't do it on dreams. We actually have to do it with the administrative fee. So I just continue to encourage everybody to understand the importance of this funding. And a lot of people want to see our families move into self-sufficiency. And our funds certainly do that as well. The Family Self-Sufficiency Program was mentioned earlier, but we help all of our families who want referrals, families who want to get job training. We do that every single day through administrative fees. So it's important that we have that full level funding as well. And of course, the dreaded landlord-tenant disputes. I won't get into the ugly mess there, but if you've been a landlord or a tenant or know of one, you understand, and really the housing authority becomes the mediator in those cases, and that is important to us and our community as well. Let me turn now to what I think a lot of people underestimate about the breadth of housing authorities. We are a major service delivery platform for the country, not just HUD, for the entire country. When a lot of issues that we speak about today as it relates to income inequality and affirmative furthering fair housing, things that matter, particularly as we're seeing the urban core change. We are typically the one entity that's making change happen on the ground, certainly with our partners on the social service side and our developers, but we have a lot of responsibility, and we accept that responsibility. And so it's important that we not just look at the role that we have as housers, but if we are going to move the country forward, if we're going to be the department of opportunity that the Secretary speaks so well of, then you really have to respect the fact that housing authorities are out there doing this work every day and should be funded to that level. And, you know, we do lots of things. We have our youth initiatives. We certainly work with our vets. We have senior wellness. We work with our workforce development, and just wanted to show you some slides of people in workforce development. I'm sure many of you who do this work are familiar with these scenes, but we really work hard to try to make sure that families find value in achieving their dreams. And we're very proud to be a part of the Secretary's Connect Home initiative, one of the 28 cities to do that. And we're working hard to make sure that families have access to computers. And so we're pleased to see the funding that's included in the bill to help us take that on. I will end on one last note. I was thrilled to see new net vouchers in the budget for our families, for homeless families with children. I cannot underestimate the need of housing, not just in DC and elsewhere. And having this net new funding in vouchers is so critical to our prime directive. As a Star Trek fan, I will say. And so if you care about mobility, if you care about income inequality, if you care about all of those issues that are so easily spoken of these days, then please remember to fund housing authorities in a way that we can be helpful to this country. And I'll end there.
Adrienne, thank you very much. Before I transition to the last speaker on our panel, I want to remind folks that after this panel on appropriations, I'm going to have a separate conversation with Bob Moss from Cohn-Resnick about the tax side of the equation. And we're already seeing some excellent questions about the role of the low-income housing tax credit coming through on the webinar. It's relevant for all of these work on the HUD side, but we'll get directly to the tax questions in the later part of the webinar. So stay tuned. With that, I am going to turn it over to Susan Dewey, the Executive Director of the Virginia Housing Development Authority, to give us a state-level perspective. Susan, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm not sure if everyone knows Virginia Housing Development Authority is Virginia's housing finance agency. We are quasi-governmental or independent, but we work very closely with the state's Department of Housing and Community Development to address housing needs. So I'll be looking high level at the whole state of Virginia today because I sit on their board and of course run VHDA to look at it as a whole about what we see in Virginia. I'm probably going to, some of my comments are going to add on to and emphasize what you've already heard today from Laura, Aaron, and Adrienne. But just to begin, as most of you know, rental assistance is a critical need. HUD resources are certainly an important funding element for affordable housing in Virginia, especially the provision of basic safety net rental assistance. I'm glad to hear Laura talk about the ask for more dollars for this important need because states can only supplement the federal rental assistance on a limited basis to address critical priorities. And, you know, it's been very difficult for state budgets recently with the economic downturn, so there hasn't been a lot of money, I know, in Virginia for us to address affordable housing needs. We are really, again, pleased the President's budget request not only fully funds current housing choice vouchers, but also provides significant funds for incremental units to help end homelessness among families with children. In addition, we need incremental new voucher units to address the critical backlog of needs among persons with disabilities who many states, including Virginia, are under a federal court settlement, DOJ, agreements to serve. And that's a very big need in Virginia. I'm going to move to some of the key program issues slide. I'm going to start with Housing Choice Voucher Administration. Our role is to assist localities in Virginia that don't have the capacity to fully administer the program on their own, generally where they don't have a public housing authority. So we do currently administer about 19% of the state's housing vouchers. That's 9,600 vouchers and these are all critical to our mission to assist families in need of a place to live, affordable place to live. Right now, our program provides waiting list preferences to the elderly, persons with disabilities, the homeless, including, of course, homeless veterans. And in fact, 47% of our voucher program serves these important populations. I'm agreeing with what Adrian was talking about in the need to have our administrative costs fully funded. That's been a real challenge for all of us in this area of voucher administration. And it has, for us, often taken funds away from other important needs in order to be able to close that administrative cost gap. We are very pleased and hope this goes forward that HUD will be able to fully fund administrative costs in its budget as it has outlined in its budget proposal. Now, as you heard just a minute ago, I know Bob's going to be talking a little bit more about the tax credit side, but it does kind of connect to a lot of these other programs. We do administer the housing tax credit, low-income housing tax credit program in Virginia, and that has been an important resource to really leverage other spending, HUD, rural housing, to meet housing needs. However, I think we cannot continue to rely on the low-income housing tax credit program to solve all of the affordable housing issues without expanded resources in this area also. I'd like to also say, in addition to probably being the most effective federal housing program out there these days, the tax credit program is really the glue that seems to be holding together HUD and rural housing programs. So it's very imperative that we continue the tax credit program in much the same way as it's already laid out, but hopefully looking at more resources in this area also. It's been a very important program for us to address our key state priorities, such as providing housing for people with disabilities and green building construction or energy efficiency. I'd also like to mention that we support, and I think Bob will talk more about this, the ability to convert private activity bond caps into more 9% tax credits to maximize these resources. One of the things I'd like to highlight is the GAO has been looking at the possibility of moving oversight of this program towards HUD, and we are concerned about that because one of the things that we've seen in the tax credit program is they've given the states abilities to really address the most critical needs within those states. And so we think it has led to a very good, strong utilization of the resources, and we'd like to continue the way it is currently being administered. I wanted to move now to the RAD proposals. One of the things that and our role in this really is that a lot of our housing authorities in Virginia are looking to the tax credit program to help with the RAD projects. Originally, I think it was discussed that 4% credits would be able to be used, but we have found that most of them are needing 9% credits. So as we talk about and hear the proposal to lift the cap on RAD, we are wondering how that might be done, hopefully in a staged manner, because if it's just totally lifted, we think there'll be really a tsunami of housing authorities looking for us to provide the 9% tax credits to access and the scarce resources that we already need for other housing needs. So we're really looking at that. Again, VHDA is working with our public housing authorities, but we have to look at all of the various housing needs that exist across the state. On our RD program, we do partner closely with RD, and I'd like to mention that due to some budgetary irregularities over the last several years, as well as this year, there has been an interruption in the flow of rural housing rent subsidies for our rural properties. And this has meant that in some cases, owners were unable to pay their mortgages, And the burden fell on VHDA as well as other lenders' shoulders because we weren't receiving payments. So this is a big problem. It's not the homeowner's fault, but we do hope that this issue has been resolved because it has really caused a gap in the past several months. From a home ownership perspective, in the last 2 years, the process of obtaining rural development's commitment has become burdensome, often taking more than 30 days to obtain a commitment from RD. And that's a concern because, as most of you know, if you try to buy a house, it can mean that that potential home buyer might lose that home. So we understand that RD is considering implementing a delegated pilot program, and we really are interested in that process and how it might streamline the process of purchasing a home. The next issue I'd like to discuss on the next slide, veterans homelessness. And we're excited about our accomplishments that we've had in Virginia in this area. This past Veterans Day, our Governor Terry McAuliffe, announced that Virginia met the goal of functionally ending veterans homelessness for all of its veterans, the first state to do so. And to accomplish this goal, our partners from across the state helped more than 1,400 homeless veterans in the period from January 2014 to November 2015. We played an active role at VHDA by providing funding for technical assistance, and with this support, communities were able to identify their homeless veterans and map out the process for coordinating housing and services. We also administer the VASH housing vouchers in partnership with the VA, and we administer these vouchers in the same areas covered by our Housing Choice Voucher programs. So we're really pleased that these vouchers have had an important role in helping us to end veterans homelessness in Virginia, and we appreciate HUD's support, continuing support of this important program, particularly given the large number of veterans that live in the state of Virginia. On the home program, I think a lot of you know, and if you go back to what you saw, that waterfall recently, there's always concern over the amount of money that's left for the home program, and that concern we've really had to live with in Virginia and other states over the past few years. It's scarce to begin with, and to the extent that home is either cut or its growth fails to keep pace with the needs, then there's an increasing demand for gap financing, and where might that come? So that has a direct impact on the ability to get rental housing deals done in the state of Virginia. Home resources also serve as a critical tool in improving communities by assisting existing homeowners with the repair or rehabilitation of owner-occupied units, and it enables those lower-income families to purchase a home through down payment assistance programs. Today, down payment assistance is one of the most significant barriers to home purchases by young families, our millennials, and our underserved minority households. Any loss of home funds to meet this need that would really have an impact on home ownership assistance and ability for our affordable housing to move forward in Virginia. We appreciate the President's budget request does not have any further cuts to this program and would level fund home at least at the same level as fiscal year 16. In this context of static home fund, we are excited to see appropriations for the states from the National Housing Trust Fund, and we do understand that the trust fund is intended to serve more deeply targeted needs that are often served through home, and really is more of a supplement, not just an offset for those home funds, but it will help us to address the worsening rent affordability problems facing Virginia and all of the states across the nation. And before I close, as we speak of home ownership, I'd like to mention the federal FHA insured loan program as well as the RD and VA guaranteed programs. These are programs that we work with at VHDA, and they're very important to being able to provide first-time home buyer financing. And one thing that I heard early in the presentation, I think it was in Laura's presentation, is a proposed fee increase on the FHA program. And even if that fee increase is a lender fee increase, we all know that those fee increases get passed to the borrower. And anything that adds an additional impact on the cost of borrowing for the first-time home buyer is a concern for us, because the FHA program is really the bread and butter for state housing finance agencies and ultimately our first-time home buyers. So I've gone through, really tried to supplement what some of the other speakers have talked about, but I think we really do want to see how the President's budget moves forward, and are excited to see the proposals for some new funding streams and hopefully to at least keep what we currently have. So that completes my presentation.
Thanks very much, Susan, and thank you to all of the presenters. We're going to move now to a Q&A section. I have been reading the questions coming in through the webinar. I encourage you to submit more through that. You can also submit them through Twitter. I'm trying to watch both screens, and I'll do my best there. What I'm going to do is try and synthesize some of what's coming in, pose them to our panelists, give everyone a chance to participate. Won't necessarily be going in exact order, but I will try and cover all the bases. Before we start into that, I do want to remind folks to stay tuned after the Q&A, because we're going to have one more section talking about the tax side of the equation with me and Bob Moss. So there's a lot of good stuff still here, and then even more to come. One theme that is coming out in a number of the questions is around the rental assistance demonstration, or RAD, that has come up in each of your remarks, which I think is interesting. I have a couple of specific questions on it for Laura, but then I'm going to kind of step through each of our panelists and get your reactions and your thoughts on the future of the rental assistance demonstration, what it means for property renovation, for changing communities, just where you see it going. But Laura, the two questions that came through on the webinar, one was, what is the $50 million proposed in the budget specifically for? Because in the past, RAD has been a not appropriated funds program. It's just working with the existing resources. And secondly, what program evaluation does HUD plan? Are you already tracking outcomes? What's your thinking there? So start with those, share additional thoughts, and then we'll step through with Aaron, Adrian, and Susan for other thoughts on RAD.
Sure, thank you. That's a very good question. So I think I want to emphasize the demonstration part of RAD's name, because we are learning. We are going to keep learning, and we have so far at the end of 2015 closed 28,000 units, which has leveraged $1.8 billion, which is what we hoped it would do, right? But we're still learning. We're still figuring this out. We're still working with PHAs and with owners across the country to figure out how to make it better, stronger, faster. And we did propose $50 million last year in the budget. Congress didn't take us up on it, but this year we're trying to be more specific about what that $50 million is for. So in the ideal state, the RAD deals work on the basis of the capital and operating fund that a property gets. And as Adrian has pointed out, that's not always enough. So for deeply distressed properties, for 202 PRACs in particular, where those subsidies cannot make the deal work, the $50 million is intended to be an incremental subsidy to make those deals work. Because there are some that work without it, there are a lot that don't work without an additional subsidy, so that's what the $50 million is designed to address. And we are constantly tracking outcomes. The Secretary is obsessed with outcomes. So we want to make sure that we have the right tracking systems around folks who have participated in RAD, that we are making sure to get the before state and the during state and the after state and the after state and the after state, so that we learn the most that we can about what interventions make sense, what works best for families, and what works best for PHAs. We're always streamlining our process, right? There's just a how you get this work done element, and I know it's not always easy to work through HUD and new processes. So we are constantly looking to do continuous process improvement and make our process as streamlined as it can be, given that it's new, right? So we're still learning and evaluating as we go, but we will be doing much more outcome measurement in future years.
Aaron, thoughts on RAD?
Well, I think there's a robust pipeline of RAD projects, so we do support lifting the cap. However, I do understand Susan's point that there's no question that it does create demand on the tax credit program and other soft subsidy sources at the state and of course at the local level. but it's really been an effective tool, I think, to revitalize public housing. So that it does mean we should really look at expanding the tax credit program and try and use the 4% credits to the greatest extent possible in particular deals.
Adrian.
So RAD is a powerful tool, and the power that it brings to housing authorities who want to exercise it as a tool is two-pointed. One, predictable funding. You know, each year I do, like, sit with my CFO and I call it budget by dartboard. It's like, what do we think we're going to get next year from HUD? And we try to plan, but it's really hard when you're a property manager to plan with any accuracy when you just don't know what your operating fund and your capital will look like. And so we're very supportive of it because it provides this predictable level of funding. But also, and very important to housing authorities, we are able to leverage our assets in a way that we have not before unless we did a hope, six, or a choice. And that's very powerful. And so I showed a slide earlier of Kelly Miller and those townhomes. So we have lots of wonderful sites like that throughout DC that don't need the level of a redevelopment of a Greenleaf and a Barry Farm, but do need more funding than they have right now to stay stable for the next 20 years. So from a housing authority perspective, particularly DCHA, very supportive of RAD. We have our own applications in the door, and for those folks, I've heard that a lot of folks are concerned about what do residents lose through the RAD program. My experience has been that so far is that residents' rights are actually really built in there, very much so, more than most programs I've seen in the past. So I don't know that that's a point of concern. I just think that's an educational point to explain.
Susan, thoughts on RAD?
Well, I mentioned my biggest issue, and that is, and I brought this up in many meetings with HUD, and I know I usually don't get any response, is the concern that 9% are asked to address a lot of issues, and we have been able to award tax credits to some of the RAD deals, and there are a lot of good RAD deals out there, but if the cap is listed, how are we going to continue to fund them through the 9%? From a financing standpoint, because VHDA does do long-term mortgage financing for these types of projects, we're also concerned about use agreements, and if the funding stops, what that might mean if they have to remain as affordable housing, but there's no funding stream. That issue has not been addressed either, and that's an issue for the financing side. So I think there are a lot of issues out there, need for more funding and need to really look at the financing side before we move forward in a big way.
Excellent. Let me change gears a little bit. We've had a few questions around tenant protection vouchers. Aaron raised it in his remarks. The questions, and I'm doing my best to combine them here, focus on whether there's enough in the account to cover the need, specifically whether it will cover the need arising from maturing mortgages as opposed to other events that trigger tenant protection. And yeah, I think those are the biggest issues. I'm probably doing a slight disservice here, but we're going to move forward. So I'm going to let Laura go first, and then any of the other panelists who want to chime in on this, go ahead. So Laura.
So I hear the concern, and we hear this concern every year. We do believe that this covers the need between carryover and the current year's request. We do believe it covers the need, but I want to assure folks that we're watching it carefully, because these are conversations that, and I don't know if OMB is on the phone, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. These are conversations that we continue to have with the Hill through the iteration of this process, and they ask that question too. So whenever it is that the final bill is being written, they do check back with us, and we have very robust and frank conversations about what the need is that we're seeing at that time. This is the challenge of writing a budget about 1.5 years before it's going to be enacted, is that you constantly have to check back and make sure that your estimates are current and up to date, and if things have changed, that you have that channel of communication. Of course, we run everything by OMB, so I'm going to put that caveat there.
Do other folks on the panel want to chime in on this? Aaron or Susan?
No, I think I said my part of it, and I think Laura had a good response. So
Okay.
Yeah, and we mostly in Virginia, VHDA focuses on the tenant-based vouchers. That's where we really put most of our emphasis.
Got it. All right, then let's look at a different piece, one that doesn't come through appropriated funds, the National Housing Trust Fund. We've had a couple of good questions on here. It's something certainly NHC is paying a lot of attention to. We understand that the funding for the NHTF comes from funds Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been setting aside throughout the year, and they transferred over. One of the questioners was curious about how the number in the budget relates to your understanding of what's already been set aside, whether there's a little bit of wiggle room in that, just from different accounts we hear of how much is going in. If you can give us more certainty there, that would be helpful. But then after Laura does that, I would open it up to the whole panel to talk about what opportunities you see with the National Housing Trust Fund. How does it change the picture of creating and preserving affordable housing, especially for extremely low-income households? So Laura first, and then we'll go backwards. Susan, Adrian, and Aaron.
Sure. So what the budget says, and we were pleased to see it, is that the Housing Trust Fund, the fees from Fannie and Freddie will generate $182 million for FY16, so that's the year that we're sitting in right now, and for FY17, $136 million. All of this is based on volume, so the FY16 number in particular is based on Fannie and Freddie volume as of December 31st, so cumulative up to December 31st. As we are now in February, we are fairly confident that those numbers are going to stick and that they are scrubbed, but we're always checking to make sure that the volume estimates are correct. At the point that the budget had to be printed, that is what OMB believed was $182 million. I hear that the check is in the mail. I have someone sitting by the front door waiting to receive it. But we do believe it's $182 million for this year, which I remember not that long ago we were concerned about meeting the minimum threshold for every state, and so I'm thrilled that we are not having that discussion, and we anticipate that we will have that money in our account and be ready to push it out very shortly.
Susan, thoughts on the National Housing Trust Fund?
Well, you know, initially it's not a substantial amount of money, but we will certainly look forward to using it because of it being targeted more to the lowest income families. We're hopeful this will be a resource to help us address some of the most critical, difficult to serve populations, such as persons with disabilities. For example, as I mentioned earlier, our desire to have more community housing alternatives available for people with intellectual and developmental disability pursuant to our Department of Justice settlement. So we are looking forward to being able to further our goals in those areas through the use of the trust fund money.
Excellent. Adrian, thoughts?
I'm just hoping housing authorities have access to it. Those of us who are not the receiving, the receiver of the funds, it's certainly a new tool in the toolkit. I'm pleased that it's finally being implemented. Happy for all the advocacy around it, and I'm ready to compete for those funds and build some more affordable housing.
All right. Aaron, as a nonprofit, what are your thoughts here? So Aaron may be muted, or we may be having technical difficulties. We can always circle.
Sorry about that. I think it'll be. I got it. I think it'll be an important gap filler for preservation projects because those are units occupied by extremely low-income households, and that will help meet certainly the targeting requirements. For new production, it'll also be important, but it may need to be coupled with some project-based vouchers, which hopefully the states and localities will be able to help coordinate.
Great. We have one follow-up, Laura, for you on the National Housing Trust Fund. This is from Peter Lawrence at Novogradac. He writes that $182 million is estimated to come from Fannie and Freddie for the Housing Trust Fund, but $170 million is planning to be allocated to states. Why is $12 million being held back, if indeed that's what's happening?
I'll trust Peter to ask a question I can't answer. So thank you, Peter.
He's asked me to, and I can't answer.
So I will have to look into that. I know that we are counting on Treasury making the correct analysis about what goes into the Capital Magnet Fund, what goes into the Housing Trust Fund, et cetera. And so I would say that's a little opaque right now, but we will keep on top of it and be as transparent as we can be, but I would say that's still a little bit of a question mark in my mind as well.
Okay, so more to come, and we will follow up and make sure we all get the answer to that one. But fair enough. All right, we've talked a lot about the rental side of the equation. We've had a couple questions about home ownership. Susan certainly brought it up. Adrian touched on it a little bit when we're talking about family self-sufficiency because it's an outcome there. Laura, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Susan and Adrian and Aaron if he wants. Talk about what opportunities for affordable home ownership are in here in the budget proposal and where you see that going.
Sure. So one of the things that we didn't call out on the slides is our housing counseling program, which we're requesting at $47 million. That is flat from last year, but we're trying to make it more effective in a couple of ways. So one of the general provisions, one of the legislative proposals that we have in the budget is that HUD would be able to receive, I want to make sure I word this carefully. Let me start by saying HUD cannot take funding from other folks who would like to do housing counseling. They recognize that we do it really well. We have a tested and tried and true program, but we cannot have other organizations who perhaps want to partner with us, philanthropic organizations or other organizations that want to give us money. We can't physically take it and give it away. We would very much like to, so we put a proposal in the budget for us to be able to accept those contributions and give them to our very qualified and certified housing counselors, which we think will magnify the impact, right? We want to make sure that we're doing counseling well, that we are evaluating it, and we know that we do that well. We just, at this point, can't take other folks' money to do it. We are always interested in receiving checks in the mail and putting them to good use, so we've asked for that permission. So that's one of the most important ways that we've got pre-purchase and post-purchase counseling on our minds in this budget.
Excellent.
So home ownership has always been a key mission for the DC Housing Authority in three components. Number one, starting with our voucher program. Big fan of the family self-sufficiency program. Does a great job helping our families move to the outcome of home ownership. We escrow the additional income that families receive, and they can put it toward a down payment. So it's a nice, easy slide into home ownership, and then families are able to use their voucher toward the mortgage. We have families in DC who actually don't use their voucher and actually have the asset of getting the down payment, and they relinquish their voucher because they wanted to be able to do it on their own. That doesn't always happen, but it's certainly important. So we're very pleased to see that those funding for coordinators are still in the budget. The second, our redevelopment sites have always included a home ownership component, and that's now happening primarily through choice. So as we have more choice sites, we see more sites that were distressed having new rental housing and new home ownership opportunities for low and moderate income families, and I think that is something that we can all be excited about. And thirdly, as a moving to work agency, we have been able to create innovative home ownership structures for our families. We have a whole public housing site that through Moving to Work we created our ABLE program where the entire site is a home ownership incubator. And the families who live there because they want to graduate into home ownership one day, and they have a running start by learning to take care of their units as homeowners with. So very excited about the budget's emphasis on home ownership and looking forward to working with others to make that happen.
Great. Susan, thoughts on home ownership?
Yes, this is a big part of what we do at VHDA. I wanted to go back to what Laura was saying about housing counseling. We put a lot of emphasis in working with our housing counseling partners throughout the state. Some of that is our grant administration of HUD grants. Some is our own internally generated funds that we put out with our partners for counseling, and we have been able to utilize some money that's come into us from settlement agreements from the banks, for example, and it has come to us, and we've been able to administer that funding stream for counseling also. We have a big push for home ownership education. We provide free housing education, home ownership education, and we are provide that free of charge. It can either be in person or online, and we require that anyone that gets a VHDA loan or a loan through VHDA has to have that first-time home buyer education. About 3 times more classes are offered than actually turn into loans, but it is something that we believe is part of our mission. And then, of course, we provide a lot of affordable housing programs I mentioned earlier, FHA, RD, VA, as well as we do have some conventional programs where we work with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So we have the whole gamut of first-time home buyer opportunities, and we are also putting some of our own internal funds to work now. We're going to be launching a down payment assistance grant. As I mentioned earlier, down payment assistance is the most important thing for lower income borrowers, and we're going to be putting out a grant that will be available throughout the state for affordable housing. So we're excited about that opportunity as well.
Excellent. Aaron, anything to add on homeownership?
Nope.
Okay. Then, so I have one more question, and then we'll go to the final thoughts, which I am calling bad news, good news. So I'll ask each of you to pick out one thing that makes you go, and then something that you're really excited about, right? So, and it's important to do them in that order. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about a theme that Laura started out early on, which is connecting people to opportunity through housing. So sometimes that means helping create opportunity where people live right now, and sometimes that means helping them find a pathway to a place that has more opportunity. And we know we need to do both because there's too many people in too many places to just do one. We've had a couple of questions about the new proposed mandatory funding, the $300 million for reducing barriers to development. Can you give us more detail on that, or is that still in that sort of early budget, hey, it's a cool thing, but in sketch only?
It's fairly in sketch only right now because we want to start the conversation with Congress about how to appropriately write that portion of the budget. But what we know through talking with our partners across the country is that it's not always, even if the money's there, it's not always easy to make it happen. And what is it that HUD can do through our leverage and through our support and helping to bring the right partners to the table to make sure that those conversations are happening and that we knock down those obstacles. So we're still sort of formulating around what that is because we want to have that conversation with our partners, with all of you, and with Congress. But we know that it's far too difficult and it's not always something HUD can control, right? But it's about getting the right people around the table. I would use examples of VASH and other places where HUD has been able to be a convener and to force the conversation as sort of the spirit in which we are taking this, where let's get the right folks around the table. This happens around COCs, this happens around PHAs. Let's make sure we've got all the local housing developers, we've got the cities and towns, we've got folks who are working to overcome these obstacles to have a conversation about what would be most useful and a most useful use of this $300 million proposed budget item.
Got it. That's very helpful. Thoughts on this fund? We'll do Adrian, then Susan, then Aaron if you want. Totally optional. We got a no from Adrian. All right. Aaron, you want to chime in on the $300 million?
No.
Okay. Susan?
One of the barriers I mentioned earlier that I'd like Laura to take back is in these RAD financings, and that's these long-term use agreements. You know, generally when we do financing, if whatever, if the development is not able to pay its mortgage, then we foreclose, and if need be, it can be market rate housing. And this has been a big barrier because if you are financing a RAD deal, then you take the risk that even if the funding dries up, you wouldn't be able to maybe make the best use of that property long term. So that's something I would like for HUD to take into consideration.
Absolutely, Susan. That's something that I've heard from our HUD folks as well, and so I'll take that back, and I also want to formally apologize for any answers you didn't get before in terms of 9% and 4%, but I'm the only hogshead at HUD, so email me and I'll connect you to the right people.
Good job. Thank you.
Sure.
Excellent. All right, so we have just enough time to do final thoughts, and again, we're going to do this bad news, good news format. We'll start with Susan, then go to Aaron and Adrian, and then we'll let Laura have a final thought. You don't have to quite follow good news, bad news, because you brought all the news, so that's okay. But I will remind folks, please stay tuned after we conclude this panel because we have one more section focusing on the tax side, on the low-income housing tax credit, the pressures for tax reform. We have Bob Moss, who's been incredibly patient, waiting for his turn, coming up next. So don't leave us, stick around. But then we're going to do bad news, good news, and I forgot the order I was going to do. Susan is first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, as mentioned several times, one of the things both Adrian and I are excited about is full funding for administrative fees. That's been an issue with anyone that's been administering the voucher program for some time, and those dollars have to come from somewhere, or either staff gets cut and then there's not the best administration of these programs. So I think everybody's really excited and hopeful that that will go through. I also mentioned again the concern I have is about the RAD. I think RAD is a great program, but the funding has to come from somewhere, and if it's a tax credit program, I'd like to see some push for additional tax credits to be awarded to all the states in order to make these RAD deals work. So that's probably our chief concern, and I'm interested in hearing from Bob Moss as he talks about this issue.
And Susan, this is Ethan just interjecting. You're right. We need to push for more tax credits. It's an incredibly powerful resource, and that push is already building. So, you know, we're all on board with you there.
Great. Thank you.
Next up, Aaron.
So my chief concern would be adequate funding for home and CDBG, and we have to get those funding levels up and for all the reasons we've talked about in this webinar. The good news, I'd say, would be the homeless funding and the new vouchers and the focus on it coming off a very successful effort on veterans housing. It's time to really focus on homeless prevention and rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing for homeless families.
Excellent. Adrian.
So the good news is new net funding for vouchers, at least new vouchers, maybe not net funding, but no, new vouchers, that's always welcome. Certainly more funding and choice, always hoping to make sure more folks have access to that, and lifting the RAD cap. I think for a lot of folks who aren't doing choice and just need to stabilize their stock, the RAD cap lift is something that's very important. Bad news, for the life of me, I can't understand why we continue to reduce the capital fund. The capital fund is the lifeline to many housing authorities who have major repairs that they have to do. I think that we're going in the wrong direction there, and we have for some time now. That's disappointing. And also, I think we need to take a careful look and make sure that the new admin fee study is the right vehicle to use to fund the admin fee.
I'm glad you brought up the capital fund backlog. Just as a personal note, I worked side by side with folks at Onsite Insight who back in 2010 was doing that capital needs assessment, which back then saw a $26 billion capital backlog, which we're not making a dent in with lower funding. So it is an ongoing concern for me watching how the public housing portfolio evolves. So sorry for the editorial moment, but moderator privilege. Laura, you get the last word on this panel.
Okay, that's exciting. So I'm contractually obligated to say that the budget is perfect, and so there, you've heard it. I am concerned, and this is as someone who feels like we've done a really good job of sticking to the budget agreements, and this is also as a former appropriator, that I'm concerned that there's talk about not sticking to those agreements because that will only slow down the process, and I was very hopeful. I still am hopeful that we can stick to regular order and that we could get the appropriations bills done, but that is a concern for me. And then what I'm most excited about is a couple things, if I could take a liberty. I should have started by saying thank you. I am really encouraged and impressed by the advocacy that all of you did around home in particular last year. So all of the efforts that you put forth meant that we did not end up with $67 million for home. We ended up at $900 million, and that is tremendous because we were not going to be able to function at $67 million, as you know, and so that just shows the power of this advocacy group and what you all do when you go to talk to Congress. Of course, I can't ask you to do that, but I'm really thrilled that you did last year. And I'm very excited about all of the research-based decisions that we were able to make, all of the interagency decisions that we were able to make. This $11 billion homelessness ask is something that we did with the Interagency Council on Homelessness, with HHS, with VA, and that just shows that we're getting better and stronger at working across the federal government, which you all do on a daily basis. You have to work with all of us. We have not always been, as a federal government, working together as effectively as we could be, and I think this budget shows that we're getting there. We're working better together, and I hope that that shows in what you all have to deal with as well. I hope it's showing out there that we are trying very hard to coordinate across agencies better.
And I think that's the perfect note to end this section on, because it highlights both the powerful forward direction, but the fundamental limitations of very limited discretionary spending, which is why the tax size looms so large. And that's why we're devoting a whole section of this budget forum to talk about the budget on the tax side, because we spend money through the tax code just like we spend money through the appropriations process. So it's my privilege now, after thanking all of our panelists for an excellent job, Adrian, Susan, Aaron, and Laura, this was just what I had hoped for. Thank you very much. But now I get to introduce Bob Moss, who is a longtime partner here at NHC. He is the Principal and National Director of Government Affairs at Cohn-Resnick, and really one of the people I look to for his expertise on the tax credit program and how we can strengthen it. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Ethan. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can. It's great to hear your voice.
Well, the panels this afternoon have been great. The panelists have been great, very lively. Now we switch to tax reform, and hopefully this can be helpful for all of you that are looking forward to an increase in the program. But first, I want to talk a little bit about one of the questions you had, Ethan, is why is there so much talk about tax reform right now? And where is this pressure for tax reform coming from? It's really coming from small business. It's up in arms about the 35% corporate rate. And it's really about inversions, which has Congress and the administration up in arms. I think if you look at the overall projected tax revenue for last year on the OMB chart, which I have here in a second, it takes about 3 seconds to pull that up. It helps you understand that almost 80% of the federal revenue last year was generated by individual income and payroll taxes. The rest of the revenue, for the most part, came from corporate income taxes, as well as miscellaneous and excise taxes. You can also see in the next chart why the word simplification, you hear that quite a bit when you hear people talking about tax reform. There are currently 7 individual tax brackets, there's 4 qualifying sections, and the tax code has gotten larger and larger and larger. Ethan, you also wanted to talk about the politics a little bit?
Well, let's pause for just a second, Bob, because I think this is exactly the context folks need, but I want to assure folks that we're moving from the bigger picture very quickly to talking about the low-income housing tax credit, right? Because it's how does change in the tax code get to doing housing on the ground, especially rental housing. And the reason we're starting with this, hey, where's the pressure for tax reform coming, is so people can understand the legislative environment and how it affects what opportunities they are, both to preserve the credit in the form that it is and potentially to expand it. So, yes, I think if you could talk about the politics, that would be very helpful, especially how bipartisan an effort this is and whether that's a big change from last year.
Thank you, Ethan. Well, I think that we have to look at the tax reform discussions and when they started in 2013 to get where we want to get today. If you look at the tax reform drumbeat, it started in 2013 under Senate Finance Chairman Max Baucus and Ways and Means Chairman David Camp. David Camp said that the tax code had more words than the Bible, but none of the good news. Max said the code was a rotting road carcass that smelled worse every day. They held hearings. Ways and Means Committee held hearings on every portion of the code, including the low-income housing tax credit. I know, I was there. That was a great opportunity to explain the program, especially with both future Ways and Means chairmen sitting on the committee, Kevin Brady and Paul Ryan. And I want to make the point that they went outside of Washington Max and David on the Max and Dave Roadshow, where they visited companies like 3M in Minnesota to talk about tax reform goals. But a funny thing happened, and Max and Dave came back from that August recess ready to launch tax reform legislation to tackle the tax code. But as September went away, as the budget impasse over appropriations and defunding Obamacare heated up, we found the government shutdown. And even that government shutdown took the air out for 2013. Otherwise, we might have had tax reform. Fortunately, we had a budget agreement done by Patty Murray, Senator Patty Murray, and Paul Ryan, and that took the air out of the rest of the year. But what really happened in January of 2014, when they came back and were ready to go, there's Patty and Paul Ryan. When we came back, next August left for China. And so Dave Campos didn't have a partner anymore, and found out that his new partner, Ron Wyden, his vision of tax reform was not an overhaul immediately, but a two-year extenders package to get us past the 2016 elections. So Camp went out on his own, and on February 26th released a plan that we all know about. That plan consolidated the existing 7 brackets that we looked at to 10, 25, and 35%. The rate reduction was phased in over 5 years, and while virtually every tax expenditure was eliminated, the proposal recognized and made permanent the R&D credit, the Americans with Disabilities credit, and our low-income housing tax credit. Now, his plan was largely ignored in Congress. So in March 2014, he announced that he would not run for re-election. That leads us up to right now, where we are with the current speaker, Ethan.
That's right. And Bob, I'm going to, as I ask you this question, if you can maybe try scooting a little closer to the mic. The sound quality is a little tricky. We can hear you, but if you can make it clearer, that's better. I mean, the situation we're in now, it sounds like Speaker Ryan is really in the lead on tax reform, at least at this point. And do you have a sense of what his priorities are?
I do. The drumbeat is really loud again. As I mentioned, the inversions continue. A corporate inversion is what happens when a U.S.-based multinational corporation with operations in other countries restructures itself so that the U.S. parent is replaced by a foreign corporation. Congress and Paul Ryan are not waiting around for 2017. They are moving forward with a tax reform plan this year as a marker for where they want to be in 2017, regardless of who wins the White House. Last week I was with Ryan. He set an aggressive timeline for tax reform. He said that it had to be done before the end of the summer, that it's going to be done during President Obama's tenure. He realized that beyond the August break, the politics of the 2016 elections will make it difficult for two parties to strike a major deal in which both sides have to compromise. But one of Paul Ryan's top priorities is comprehensive tax reform that would lower tax rates by broadening the tax base, cutting credits, deductions, and other preferences. Ryan's acknowledged that he and the White House are facing difficulty finding agreement on individual tax rates. President Obama raised the top rate in 2012 after a long and bruising showdown with the Republicans. He's not likely to budge on lowering it to the levels Republicans prefer. Nevertheless, Ryan is open to a smaller deal on the corporate side of the code, and we have to keep our eye on the low-income housing tax credit.
So, Bob, as you're thinking about where Speaker Ryan is, what do you see on the Senate side? How much alignment is there potentially with the House?
Well, I'd say that Ryan's counterpart in the Senate, Finance Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch of Utah, he has not set out any clear timeline for tax reform. Last month, however, he did offer that a tax reform deal might be struck in May, but I think he's really looking to 2017. And he may very well agree with the Ryan plan, and Ryan and Hatch have a very good working relationship. I wanted to take a look at the presidential candidates real quickly because we just saw Hillary's housing plan come out. And all of them, they're part of this this mixture of to get tax reform done, which is such a big undertaking, that we have to have the public behind it, we have to have Congress behind it, we need the White House behind it, and we need Treasury, really importantly, geared up to do it. They need to really fill up every chair of Treasury in order to get tax reform done. All of the candidates here, including not shown here because there's only so many of them we can show on one screen, have some kind of simplification plan, including a flat tax, value-added tax, and other revisions to the code. But they are far apart in where they want to be. As an example, the difference between Senator Sanders' plan and Trump's plan is almost $24 trillion apart. So there are a lot of radical ideas, but it's clear that tax reform is in their sights now as they campaign. What version in 2017 is a tough question to answer.
I think that's right, and I'm glad you said it in the context of the presidential race. Let me try and zoom in a little to where we as housers, as housing stakeholders, can be relevant here. The low-income housing tax credit looms very large to us. In the scheme of the tax code, as you put out that pie chart at the very beginning, we're actually really small. So is there room to increase this resource given how well it has performed over the past 30 years and how much bipartisan support it has gotten? And if so, what should we as housing stakeholders be doing?
Well, in meetings since the beginning of this year with both Pat Seabury and Senator Cantwell, they have told us that the industry must be more vigilant in our education efforts in order to ensure that the credit survives tax reform. That was the strategy recommended by David Camp, which was get members of Congress to grand openings in their districts or states. There's a 100% success rate that goes along with getting a member to a grand opening. Pat Seabury is open to an increase in the program, but first wants to see more education efforts done. Senator Cantwell, however, has recently told some people that she would think about an increase. She hasn't committed to it, but where that falls out, we don't know. But I think that we are very fortunate that in the fall taxi bus bill or omnibus bill, when the 9% fixed question came before the Ways and Means Committee, that a majority of the House Republican members on that committee stood up and said, yes, we want the 9% fixed included in the bill. So that bodes well for us as we move forward.
I think that is very encouraging. I also note that within Treasury's Green Book, right, the tax writing side of the President's budget proposal, there are some interesting ideas for improving the credit. One is was mentioned earlier in the discussion around exchanging volume cap bond authority for allocated 9% credit authority. Do you have a sense of the likelihood of that and how it fits into the overall scheme of things?
Well, I think if you look at it from a political point of view, going into a majority office on the House side and asking for better utilization of the resource is an easier ask than going in and asking for just a percentage increase in the program right now. The bond exchange program, I think, may have had more merit a year or two ago. In many of the states in the past 2 years, the volume cap has been used. Excuse me, it's been utilized. And there's not as much of an overage available for a national pool to throw the 9% to turn into 9% credits as there may have been before. And I think that's because the states have done a great job. Those that issue bonds is getting the private activity bonds out to perform housing production where the 4% credit works instead of using the valuable 9% credits, as Susan Dewey mentioned.
I think that's exactly right. I have some more questions for you. I want to encourage our webinar participants to use the Q&A box to submit questions because they will have more and better ideas than I do. But while they are thinking through that, let me follow up a little bit on the 4% program. My understanding is that interest rates are probably going to rise over the next few years, likely very gradually, but we've already seen the first step in that from the Federal Reserve. I expect there'll be more to come. In a higher interest rate environment, would you, like I do, expect even more utilization of the tax-exempt bond program just because the benefit of the tax exemption on the interest is financially larger?
Well, that's been true over the years. When we had the higher interest rates in the 90s, the bonds were used. A lot of developers went with what was called low floater bonds at that time, which were floating interest rate 4% credits, and for increased cash flow on their tax-exempt bond deals. I think that could happen again.
Yep, and then like last time, we'll have all sorts of fun trying to refinance those low floater bonds when the interest rate environment changes significantly.
Well, yeah. And the appetite for the credit is so large. I think it's so much larger than it was back then. I think that we need to be careful about these low floaters, especially when the sponsor has not built in or purchased a cap on the interest rates as far as how high they can go.
Exactly. Let me change gears a little bit and ask you about the proposal for allowing greater income mixing in low-income housing tax credit properties. The idea being you could allow more extremely low and very low income units as long as there was a corresponding increase in folks at, say, 80% of area median income, as long as the average worked out to the 60% area median income baseline requirement for tax credits. This has been in Treasury's Green Book a couple of times. Do you sense some openness there?
I do, and I think it's trickled down to the Ways and Means Committee. The proposal itself has the opportunity to help properties in all locations, urban, rural. There are a number of people I've talked to around the country in the past year that like it, that are turning away people under the current rules. They're turning away people at 62, 63, families at 65% of area median income. I also think that it helps with the targeting in this environment of less soft money to help finance the deals and help make them work and provide that lower targeting down at 40% of AMI. So I think it's quite popular right now, and I think it's one of the ideas that the industry is tossing back and forth very seriously, and something that we can accomplish this year.
Excellent, excellent. I'm curious, as you think about the presidential race you brought up earlier and how that fits in the last few days we saw the first big housing proposal that I've seen from one of the candidates. Secretary Clinton put out her housing plan, which included an increase in the low-income housing tax credit. Have you seen signals, or do you have a sense that this could loom a little bit larger in the presidential race than it has already, or is it kind of too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell, but I think it sets a marker for the other candidates. I know they are all working on platforms as they march hopefully towards their conventions. The housing credit has a lot of support for many of those candidates. Many of them do not support it. They haven't come out and said it, but their silence is deafening. I think that the kind of forum that was held down in Columbia earlier this year with Paul Ryan and Senator Tim Scott helped make housing part of the conversation for many of these candidates. And I think you will see by the time we get to the end of March into April, that you'll start to see platforms for housing within each of the candidates' playbooks. But I think you got to remember, tax reform only occurs every other generation, and we're now at the 30-year mark. And while a lot of people will say tax reform can never happen, or they'll say that we can never get rid of the housing credit, Congress would never get rid of it, there are forces in play this year that have never been in play before. And bad things can happen if we take our eye off the ball. So I think it's very important for all the people that are listening today, all of the folks out there, to make sure that if there's grand opening activity or groundbreaking activity that you're involved with, that you get a member of Congress out there to see it and keep the idea alive that seeing is believing, and it works.
I think that's exactly right, Bob, and I would extend it to say, if it's not the member, if it's their staff, that's also helpful. Obviously, we want as many representatives and senators to be at low-income housing tax credit properties, at affordable housing sites, to see the work that's being done, because it really changes their understanding of what actually Congress is paying for when it pays for some of this work. But I think the staff are important too, and building those relationships is helpful. I will encourage folks to take a look at the Rental Housing Action Campaign, and we will send a link to it in the follow-up from this webinar, because there's a great set of advocacy tools that campaign has put together. I know CohnReznick is a part of it, NHC is a part of it. There are many other housing advocacy organizations and private development groups and public sector entities that are all cooperating in that effort to do exactly the kind of work you've been describing, to raise awareness of the program, to help people understand its benefits, and help make sure that the policymakers understand what effect it has on people and communities, because that's ultimately, I think, the shared goal for all of us here. In terms of either recommendations for actions people can take beyond what you've already said, or thoughts for next year, this is a sort of a good closing moment. What do you see coming ahead, and how should folks get involved?
Well, I think you've got to remember that most of the people on this call, I am pretty positive, know as much or more about housing than 90% of the staffers on Capitol Hill, and including the staffers back home in their districts. So I would encourage people to reach out to those people, reach out to the staff members on the local level, and use constituent power. And then on the presidential, regardless of who your horse is, try to get involved with the campaign as a housing person, as a go-to person to talk to about housing for that candidate. It's not that hard to do. I know a lot of people that are involved in various campaigns, but it's something that you can do right now, and it's easy as picking up the phone and calling your congressional office.
I couldn't think of better advice. I think that is extremely helpful, and it's a way for all of us as housing stakeholders to make effective change happen through the election process and through the legislative process. So, Bob, I want to say a big thank you to you for taking time to do this solo part of the budget forum with me. It's a huge benefit to all of our listeners, and it's a great help to NHC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks NHC. I really appreciate it.
And with that, I'm going to thank all of you for sticking through 2 hours with us of what I find fascinating, and I hope you found fascinating as well. This is the kind of work that NHC, with many partners, will continue to do throughout the year. We hope you will get involved with us. We hope you will get involved with our partner organizations and make your voice as housing stakeholders heard in the legislative process, to make sure that the federal government does a strong and continued job of supporting the creation and preservation of affordable housing, whether that's rented housing or owned housing. It's still homes, and it still helps shape the communities that people around the country live in. So with that, look for a follow-up email to come from us, which will have links to the slides. It will have a link to the recording of this webinar for those who missed it and want to tune in later at your leisure. You can do that. It will also have a link to the Rental Housing Action Campaign and to other resources. So again, thank you very much. And